I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. The January 6th committee has released additional deposition transcripts, including the deposition transcript it took of Ginni Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice, the MAGA extremist Clarence Thomas, and it has confirmed what many people had suspected, that in Ginni Thomas's communications with Mark Meadows following the 2020 election, with these efforts to overthrow the free and fair election, when she was referencing her best friend and confiding in her, quote, best friend, she was indeed referring to Justice Clarence Thomas in these text messages, specifically where we go to page 84 of her deposition, where she is shown these text messages. She is asked by the January 6th committee, page 84, line 5, the following question. Ms. Thomas, and Mr. Meadows responds in the last, it's white here in the exhibit that it came from. The exhibit number is this. In any event, Mr. Meadows responds, quote, "This is a fight of good versus evil. Evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Don't grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues. I stake my career on it, or at least my time in D.C. on it," end quote. Do you see that? Is the question from the January 6th committee, showing a text message from Mark Meadows with those extremist terms being sent to Ginni Thomas. The question is, do you see that? Answer, yes. Question. And then you responded just a few minutes later, quote, "Thank you, needed that. This plus a conversation with my best friend just now. I will try to keep holding on." Question. And you sent that message at a little before 11 p.m. on November 24th. Do you recall, Ms. Thomas, who you were referring to when you said you had just had a conversation with my best friend or with your best friend? Answer from Ginni Thomas. It looks like it was my husband. Question. Do you remember what you talked to Justice Thomas about that made you feel better and allowed you to say, quote, "keep holding on," end quote? Answer from Ginni Thomas. I wish I could remember, but I have no memory of the specifics. My husband often administers spousal support to the wife that's upset, so I assume that's what it was. I don't have a specific memory of it. Question. What makes you think now, as you read it, that you're referring to your husband when you say, quote, "my best friend"? Answer. Because that's what I call him, and he is my best friend. Mark is getting pretty close, though. I guess referring to Mark Meadows. Question. Oh, I don't think we're that. I mean, I've enjoyed my time here. Oh, sorry. Answer. Very good. I thought you were looking at me. So the term that you used and just sort of the context, answer yes, makes you think it was a conversation with your husband? Answer yes. I mean, Mark Meadows is a friend of mine, and my best friend that I talk about often is my husband, and he bucks me up a lot. I guess earlier she was making a joke, not that Mark Meadows was her best friend, but that the questioner was someone that would be her best friend because she thought that was funny and snarky. Question. And I think you mentioned this in your statement at the beginning of the interview. Did you talk with, especially in light of the text message, do you recall having any conversations with your husband about the fact that you were in contact with Mr. Meadows in this post-election time frame? Answer. Absolutely not. He found out in March of this year when it hit the newspapers. He had no idea that I was texting Mark Meadows about the election. Question. So even putting aside the substance of the text, you didn't talk with him about what you were saying, but even the fact of a conversation or text communications with Mr. Meadows was unknown to your husband? Answer, yes. Question, as far as you know? Answer, yes. And then Adam Schiff goes and he asks a question and he goes, yes. I just wanted to follow up very quickly on those questions. So Ms. Thomas, you've never related to Justice Thomas that you had emailed or text messaged people in the White House or Mr. Eastman or others concerning alleged fraud in the election or efforts to change or stop or decertify the results of the election? Thomas, I wouldn't use those words that you just put into your question, but I said earlier, Mr. Schiff, my husband is not interested in politics. I generally do not discuss with him my day-to-day work in politics, the topics I'm working on, who I'm calling, who I'm emailing, texting, or meeting with regarding the 2020 election. I didn't speak with him at all about the details of my volunteer campaign activities. And then she says no. So my question for you is, well, she was clearly had a conversation with her husband who comforted her about an issue relating to the overthrow of the 2020 election. That was in her message, yet she now claims in the later portions that he doesn't care about politics. I mean, can you believe that complete BS? Here, I want to show you this other portion as well, where Ginni Thomas is asked questions about Sidney Powell and then reaching out to Mark Meadows about Sidney Powell. So let's go to page 71. At the very top of page 71, these are where the questions are about another message that she sent. Question from the January 6th committee. And I'll just call your attention to the part of the text message, which is somewhat lengthy, but it says, quote, this is her message to Mark Meadows, quote, sounds like Sidney and her team are getting inundated with evidence of fraud. Make a plan, release the Kraken, and save us from the left taking America down. What did you mean by that? That's what Ginni Thomas said to Mark Meadows, where she goes, make a plan, release the Kraken, and save us from the left taking America down. What did you mean by that? Answer, oh, I was clearly emotional. I regret the language. I was just hopeful that someone with capacity could get at the fraud. Question, do you remember what led you to believe that Sidney and her team were getting inundated with evidence of fraud? I don't recall, no. Question, later that afternoon, it looks like that text was in the middle of the night. Later in the afternoon on the same day, I'll represent to you there was a press conference, and maybe you recall, there was a press conference with Mr. Giuliani, Miss Powell, and several other members of the Trump legal team that was held at the RNC here in Washington. Answer, right? Do you remember that press conference? Answer, I do. Were you watching it live? Answer, I think I was. And it looks like there are some text messages to Mr. Meadows in real time while the press conference was taking place. And do you see those? Answer, yes. Question, and your first text to Mr. Meadows is, quote, tears are flowing in what Rudy is doing right now, end quote. Do you remember what that refers to? Answer, I think somebody was identifying fraud and showing leadership and being a good communicator, and I was hopeful at the time. Question, so were they tears of joy? Is that what you meant? Answer, I guess so. Minutes later, you text, whoa, heroes. Do you remember why you were expressing that sentiment to Mr. Meadows during the press conference? Answer, I don't remember. Question, so I take it that you were impressed with the presentation by Mr. Giuliani and Miss Powell at the press conference? Answer, I was hopeful. There you have it, folks. I could show you some more. I mean, there's questions above as well, though. I mean, here, these are some great questions from Liz Cheney. And Liz Cheney confronts Ginni Thomas with evidence. You're aware that, like, even the people who worked for Trump said there was no fraud. Like, would that change your view of things if you knew that even the people who were working for Trump, like not Team Crazy, if they believe that there was no fraud here? Let me just show you these questions. This is what Liz Cheney goes. I have a question. Back on the issue that we were speaking about before, and Ms. Thomas, you were talking about concerns about fraud in the election, and I wonder, If you are aware that President Trump's advisors, his most senior campaign officials, as well as his leaders at the Department of Justice, his White House counsel, that they all had told him that there was no evidence of fraud sufficient that it would change the outcome of the election. Just if you're following along on the depositions, which you see right here on the screen, it's on page 35, line 17. Ms. Thomas responds, "No, that was news to me, Congressman." Ms. Cheney, "And so when did you become aware of that?" Ms. Thomas, "I think sometime after this committee started its work." Ms. Cheney, "And if you had been aware that the Attorney General Barr, for example, or Pat Cipollone, that if you'd been aware that they had investigated these claims of fraud and told Trump, there was no evidence to support those claims, would that have changed your view?" Ginni Thomas, "Honestly, I don't think it would have, because millions of people still found that there were irregularities with COVID changes to mail-in balloting. And there were so many other things that, I don't think there's a lot of people uncomfortable with the 2020 election, despite what this committee is pushing, okay? I just think they're still concerned. And I wouldn't have believed that some of those people you named were able to identify and track down fraud and irregularity that I was hearing from the grassroots in certain states." Cheney, "And so," this is a question from Liz Cheney, "and so you're aware that the president and his allies brought legal challenges, which was completely their right to do, but they lost 61 out of 62 of those challenges?" Thomas, "I still believe that there was fraud and irregularity, as millions of Americans do, Representative Cheney." Cheney, "So despite the fact," this is a question from Ms. Cheney, "so despite the fact that the courts had ruled in a number of instances, in fact, judges appointed by President Trump had ruled very clearly and specifically that these allegations, that the campaign's claims were not supported by the evidence, you were aware of those rules and just chose to ignore them." I'm just trying to understand. Ginni Thomas, answer, "I just think there's a lot of things that are still being uncovered, and so I believe there was fraud and irregularity, contrary to clearly what you believe." And we'll leave it at that. But you see right there, in addition to earlier in my presentation, where you saw, obviously, Clarence Thomas is involved. His name is being invoked to Mark Meadows. He's being referenced there. By the way, Clarence Thomas should absolutely recuse himself from all January 6th related cases. I mean, the fact that his name is mentioned in the January 6th committee report and that his name is mentioned to Mark Meadows, with Mark Meadows being someone who's being likely criminally investigated by the Department of Justice, someone who is criminally referred to the Department of Justice by the January 6th committee. But you see here the cultist, extremist behavior, where Liz Cheney is just confronting Ginni Thomas with, okay, you're aware that this was actually investigated by the Department of Justice and by Trump's lawyers like Cipollone, by Bill Barr, by all these people, and they found no fraud. Does that change your mind? No, I still believe what I want to believe. And you could believe what you want to believe, Liz Cheney, is what Ginni Thomas says. Well, you're aware that he lost every case he filed in court. Would that change your mind? No, the courts can believe what they want to believe. Me and the base, we're going to believe what we want to believe. You see it in these statements right here in this deposition. What the problem, it's a crisis of rationality. It's a radical extremist cult, a dangerous cult with dangerous links in the United States Supreme Court, as close as those links can possibly be. Happy I could bring this to you, the actual data, what was stated in the deposition, so you could see it for yourself, hear it for yourself. We can expose the truth together here on the MeidasTouch Network. I'm Ben Meiselas. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. We are on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to your support. And in addition to hitting the subscribe button, please check us out at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/MeidasTouch. We've got great exclusive content you can only get at Patreon, but most importantly, help grow this independent media platform. That's Patreon, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Until next time, I'm Ben Meiselas.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs. It wasn't rigged, you're just a loser. At store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.